I'm bang in the middle of a city that recently ranked number 1 for something.
The world's worst traffic. But even just 20 years ago when I was young, the city was completely different. It was called the pensioner's paradise or the garden city.
Many cities around the developing world, from Dhaka to Jakarta, have seen a similar transition. Indian cities, though, are arguably the most extreme. Along with China, India is seeing the fastest growth potential in car sales, which is helping the GDP grow. But anyone who drives here will tell you not only of the immense stress of sitting behind a wheel for hours, but also of breathing some of the world's most polluted air, primarily caused by vehicles. So how did we even get stuck in this mess?
And how do we get out?
Around the world, from Paris to Bogota, everyone is trying to solve the transport problem. But while car sales in the West have largely saturated, developing countries like India are still in the early stages of the curve. So I've seen things change dramatically here in my lifetime. When I was growing up, the central street looked like this.
And now when I make my yearly trips home, the city has changed so much that I barely even recognize it.
To understand what kick-started this transformation, we need to rewind to a time when I was this tiny. As I was taking my first steps, India was seeing an economic leap forward. In the early 1990s, the central government brought in liberalization policies that reduced import tariffs, lowered taxes, and deregulated markets, which meant, among other things, that the car market could mature. Bangalore specifically sold itself as an IT hub. Domestic companies grew, and largely American companies began outsourcing their software here. Incomes soared, and people from across the country flocked here like a modern-day El Dorado. Consequently, vehicle sales that were less than 50,000 in the 1980s went up to almost 3 million in 2020. Like in the West, the idea of the car as a symbol of prosperity was sold to a whole new generation.
To me, specifically, a car always has been a sales statement. I want to just keep improving the car I have.
There are, off late, since COVID has happened, I've not been feeling as safe to take the bus, so I do get dropped off or I take the car and go.
So now I have this SUV. SUV is ideal because the roads are so bad.
Overall, car ownership remains low. While in Germany or the US, there are between 600 and 800 cars per 1,000 people, in India, that number is less than 200 per 1,000 at most, mainly because it's still expensive for millions. Almost 2/3 of the population still cycles, walks, or takes public transport. But over 80% of people surveyed say they would like to own a car, which adds up in a country with a population over 1.3 billion. I'm meeting Professor Verma, who runs a famous transport lab in the city that works on bringing about systemic change.
Economy is aspiring as well as the society is aspiring. It often conflicts with these larger and sustainable development goals. It was not the situation when Americans were getting wealthier or Europeans were getting wealthier. So they enjoyed their time by enjoying their wealth, enjoying car, etc. But today Indians are told not to do so, adopt these sustainable modes and so on. So it will definitely conflict.
The city's response has historically been to create more space for cars, widening roads where they can or building flyovers. But Verma's research shows that these have and will always be ineffective.
Any opportunity where you create more space, road space, to accommodate more such personal vehicles would only encourage more and more people to buy their cars because it's affordable. We have still not reached the saturation level. So in no time, say even 6 months, you would realize that that extra widened space that you created is again filled with the cars.
India has been promoting investment in electric vehicles as a sustainable solution, which will be better for pollution, but that still won't do anything for the space problem. Often, road designs have been directly copied from the West, set in motion when planners who visited US cities in the 1990s brought back road maps. But these don't work on cities that are so densely built. And you can see this play out across the country, from the streets around my house in Bangalore to the Delhi-Noida flyway, and even the national highway network that can have up to 8 lanes, but cars hit bottlenecks as soon as they enter a city. This kind of car-centric development has gone beyond just roads. Residential complexes that are now being developed around cities are being designed with the car at the center, much like the American suburb. In a kilometer's radius from my house, 6 new complexes have been developed in the last 3 years.
This complex came up around a year ago, and there are 1,000 plus families living here, and to access their basic needs like food or schools, they have to walk a minimum of say 15 minutes, which isn't really practical. And so people living here are much more likely to become more and more dependent on their cars.
15 minutes may not sound like much, but it isn't exactly a cakewalk. The car-centric design tends to ignore the development of all other forms of transport, including walking, cycling, even to go to the bus stop, which are all, of course, more climate-friendly. Researchers call this a windshield bias. People who drive cars have been found to view the world differently from those on the street. Drivers can see pedestrians as unfriendly and even threatening. So when plans and road designs are made by the elite, people who drive cars, they tend to be skewed in favor of their own kind, alienating those on the street, furthering the divide. And when those on the street buy cars, they join the club with the windshield view, and this divisive cycle continues. This kind of design is having a disastrous impact on Indian cities.
Being stuck in traffic annoys me so much. But it's more than just annoyance. While some people, of course, use it to call up their friends or catch up on their Netflix, for a lot of people it's been known to cause chronic stress disorders.
22 of the 30 cities with the world's worst air are currently in India. Where once children played cricket on the streets, cars now park. And this loss of shared community space is one factor behind the drop in health and happiness indices across the country. Globally, emissions from vehicles are soaring. In many developing countries, they're growing several times faster than the GDP. It isn't just cars though. 2/3 of freight in India is transported by trucks, which contributes significantly. And the most common vehicles on the street are 2- and 3-wheelers, which are more affordable, and their impacts add up.
Do you see yourself like giving up your car for anything else?
Not really, no. I think because of our roads and just the traffic, so yeah, no, a car's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, I do feel guilty. I know that all that carbon footprint. But then what do you do? If there is no other system in place, you just have to have a car.
The governments at central and state level need to have a very clear-cut, focused policies to nudge the travel choices and behavior. Policies that disincentivizes the personal vehicles and their use and incentivizes the use of public transport, walking, cycling.
One example of when things went right is what happened to Church Street in Bangalore 2 years ago.
The city banned cars from the street for 6 months, but they also improved the footpaths and they made the street more walkable. Now you think that the cars just went elsewhere, but actually people started leaving their cars at home and taking public transport. And the air quality improved and noise levels came down. And local businesses were also happier.
Changing the way people interact with city centers has and is happening the world over, especially after the pandemic brought some of these issues painfully to light. Since January 2021, France has added a weight tax to the price of heavy vehicles like SUVs, which could increase their price by up to 40,000 euros. Copenhagen in Denmark has installed hundreds of kilometers of bike lanes to make the transition away from cars easier. And in Bogota, the city chose to improve the bus system over developing the highway system. Happiness indicators went up and air pollution dropped. Many residents say they would never go back to the old model. I'm speaking to Ashwati Dilip, the South Asia head of a think tank that works with governments across the region on trying out similar ideas.
And over the last year, we've seen how these cities have been also embracing this whole idea of testing, learning, and scaling. Because sometimes when you just take a solution that worked, let's say in Bogota, and just plonk it directly in a small town in South India, such as Trichy, it may not work. So what you do need to do is bring the concept, quickly test it on the ground to see, does this work in our context? And gain feedback from your citizens.
The buzzword at the moment is transit-oriented development, which is to put public transport like buses or metros at the center and develop life around it.
If we could invest even, a small percentage, less than like 5% of the funds that are invested into the metro for improving access within the neighborhoods around metro stations, then large populations living in the center of the city would be able to access the metro. Simultaneously looking at how land use in that area can be changed such that more number of people can afford to live around the metro station is also something that needs to be thought out.
Now this is an alternative kind of development and closer to how things used to be. For example, if I lived up there, I could buy my basic groceries from right across the street, or I could go to the barber down the road.
If these areas are connected to good public transport, more people will use it. And that wouldn't just be good for health or carbon emissions. It makes economic sense too. While car sales do contribute to the GDP, investment in public transport could contribute significantly more. One study compared how far investment in 3 areas will take us: road development, subsidizing cars, and developing the bus system. It found that investment in roads would allow people to take 2.8 billion trips a year, a trip being one person's journey from point A to point B. The same investment in supporting the auto industry would allow for less than 500 million trips. And that amount in improving the bus system will help people make over 10 billion trips. Which means they will then have better access to work and providing for their families, which will contribute much more to the country's economic growth. At the moment, over 80% of public spending in Indian cities goes to big-ticket projects like widening roads or building flyovers, while the rest goes to buses or metros, with less than 2% spent on supporting pedestrians and cyclists. If these wheels keep turning, developing countries like India will lose out on the unique chance to learn from the mistakes of others and leapfrog into a sustainable, equitable future.
So we're at a difficult point in time where millions of people still have unfulfilled aspirations. But we need to find creative ways to put the planet and the quality of people's lives back at the center of the story. If you have ideas, write to us in the comment section below.